Well, my wife had told me this. She said, Jim, if you really want to do this, you've got to get out of the basement. That was a metaphorical remark. And talk to people.
Hey folks, welcome back to Elm Town. I'm your host, Jared M. Smith. We'll be visiting with Jim Carlson today. But first, let's talk about our sponsor, Logistically. At Logistically, we make intuitive software to help logistics teams make better decisions and improve efficiency. Logistically pays me to record Elm Town episodes, as well as pays for our production and hosting costs. We build the front end for all new features in Elm. If you're interested in our mission and enjoy writing Elm, please drop us a line, elmtown@logisticallyinc.com. I'll put a link in the show notes. Now, Jim. Jim is a recovering academic with a history in math. He loves typed functional languages, especially Elm. He's done some parser-related work, making a LaTeX to HTML parser in Elm, which he presented at Elm Europe 2018. He also presented tarring files with Elm at Oslo Elm Day 2019. He also has a couple of packages, several, but a couple parser-related ones, including JXX Carlson /Elm Markdown and JXX Carlson /Elm L0 parser. He's done some simulations work, including the random exchange model, Schelling's segregation model, heat equation, as discussed in Making Elm Talk to Your Personal Computer at ElmConf 2019. There's some other fun stuff, including a fake drum language app. The culmination of a lot of this parser-related work, as I see it, in Scripta.io, where he has an editing and publishing platform for the web, which supports MicroLaTeX, XMarkdown, and L0. He's also done some work on Elm Notebook, which we'll talk more about later. Jim, welcome downtown.
Oh, thanks, Jared. Really glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited for this. So to get into it, one thing that I want to go back to is mention that you were on Elm Town one time before.
Yes,
and it was Elm Town 29, Kno.io with Jim Carlson. This was in 2018 with Murphy Randall, right?
That's right, yes.
Okay. Yeah, so you gave a little bit of your history then, and so I'll refer folks back to that, but do you want to kind of give us your abridged version of that today and how you see it?
Yeah, I can give the abridged version. So, I went to college in 1964, long time ago, and the summer of my second year, I had a job in the physics department where I had to learn some quantum mechanics, some numerical analysis, and some Fortran to do a project for my professor. And in those days, what I had to work on was an IBM 1620. And I had access to it from 10 p.m. at night until 6 a.m. behind locked doors. So, and the way I did my programming is I had to punch up my cards, send it through the card reader, get the output in the line printer. And, you talk about a long development cycle. That was it. So it's amazing that I actually learned how to do this, but I did, and it was a lot of fun. And then I've sort of been in and out of programming most of my career, which was, I got a PhD in mathematics and did mathematical research and taught and so forth. And I would occasionally get really hyped up about some new language and maybe use it even a little with my research. But I never really started doing serious software development, such as it is, until I retired about 10 years ago. And I think I made all the wrong moves, and I got really frustrated. But I eventually found Elm, and that really opened things up for me. So that's the brief history.
All right. Yeah. And so one thing I want to mention is that we kind of teleported Jim here due to some internet troubles, but I think we're good now. So yeah, Jim, you were saying that in your initial programming history as you were learning, you had a rather laborious task of using punch cards to write code. And so I imagine with that, there was probably a very meticulous process of going through the code and thinking about it before actually running that to the computer.
For sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, as you then retired from mathematics and academia and then went into doing more serious development work, as you called it, would you have carried over that meticulousness, or had you maybe started to use the more iterative process that we use today?
Well, I think my basic modus operandi is to just try stuff. And then if it succeeds, that's great. And if I fail several times in a row, then I have to start thinking. So that was sort of my process. But what I did, one of my early experiences, I started out with Ruby on Rails and then got into various JavaScript frameworks. And what I found is that as long as a project was small, it didn't really matter what language I was using, everything was cool. But as it grew in size and complexity, then the problems began to surface. And I learned this new and wonderful term, refactoring. And it was, for me, it was basically a scary process, because beyond a certain level of complexity, refactoring, or maybe even thinking about refactoring, could break the code. And I may not know about it until later, but and that was an especially bad way to learn about things. And at one point, I had moved to using Elixir on the back end, and I realized, okay, this is a functional language, and that was a big step up. And so I thought that, maybe I should look for a front-end functional language. That's how I discovered Elm, just by internet searches.
All right. Well, related to you and Elm, I have a question from Mario Rogic. And he says, quote, "I believe I met Jim at the first Elm Europe conference. I remember being really impressed that he'd had a little experience with Elm and decided to fly to Paris to attend a conference. Could be fun to hear about how he came to that conviction." End quote. So, Jim, what made you decide to go to a conference after learning a little bit of Elm?
Well, my wife had told me this. She said, "Jim, if you really want to do this, you've got to get out of the basement." That was a metaphorical remark. "And talk to people." So I went to Elm Europe 2017. That was my very first software conference. And the talks were great. I met Evan, and I described to him what my problem was. I had been using some Ruby stuff, and I used there was a parser for that I had been using, and it was based on all regexes. And as you know from computer science, there's a limit to what you can do with regexes. So anyway, I talked to Evan about this, and he said, "Well, maybe you should take a look at Elm Parser." And when I got home, I did. And then I realized at some point, holy cow, I could actually write a LaTeX parser using this. And so that was, for me, a huge revelation, and that really changed my life, such as it was as a programmer.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that definitely sounds like it was a big discovery, if you will.
It was. I remember Mario was the second person that I talked to at this conference. I was quite nervous about the whole thing because I had heard about these horrible flame wars in the software world and how nasty people could be. But I must say my experience there and then and after that has been just really fantastic, very, very welcoming. But it was a great conference. I learned all kinds of things. I can't remember whether it was at that conference or the next one that I also heard about Elm UI. And I remember, actually, I had fallen asleep during Matt's talk, but I got sort of the gist, and then I saw a bunch of people clustering around him and Evan afterwards, and I thought, oh, well, this is probably pretty good. So I also investigated that, and I've been using it ever since.
Okay. Yeah, that's an important discovery as well, I'd say. Yeah.
I mean, I also heard, I think at the first one I heard Mario talk about, I may be getting the sequence wrong, but he talked in one conference about Evergreen, and then one after that about Lambdera. And that's also been a big step forward for me. I've, for about 3 years now, I've been using Lambdera in almost all the apps that I do, because the lack of glue between the front end and the back end and being able to do everything in Elm and not having to manage database migrations. I mean, those things just used to make me very nervous. So that's also a big step up for me.
Yeah. So I do want to talk about your use of Lambda as well. But to kind of step back and talk a little bit more about this kind of coming out of the basement and then having these discoveries, talking with Evan and with Mario. One of the things that you had mentioned on the episode with Murphy Randall was a few things that you loved about Elm that I took away as being really important. And they're mentioned a lot today, but one of them, of course, is the fearless refactoring. Another was modeling the problem well, being able to do that with Elm. And then another one that you, I believe, took from your math days was changing the approach to a problem. So with those, particularly this one about changing your approach, I know that, you just sometimes have to try things, right? Is there a pattern to how you go about that, or do you just keep at it?
Well, I think it's similar to what I said. My usual approach is I just dive in, and then when I'm faced with a lot of trouble, then I start thinking about things. It's maybe not the best approach, but it's just, I guess it's part of my personality. So, this is where Elm really, really shines because, for example, in my work on the LaTeX to HTML compiler, I call it a compiler because there are lots of stages. There's a parsing stage, and then there's a rendering stage, and there are various other stages. But I found that my original approach is not always the right one, and I had to change, absolutely core data structures. And one of the great things about Elm is that you can do that. You just go in there and you rip up some stuff and you change some stuff, and nothing works. And then an hour later, or maybe in a really bad case, a day later, it's all working, and you can be completely confident in it. It's not like worrying that there's some hidden defect that will surface 2 months later when a user complains about why stuff is not working right.
Right. Yeah. So that for me was a huge win when I came to Elm after having worked in large code bases for my career, throughout my career, and kind of living with this growing anxiety, and particularly working in healthcare. It was very important to have that confidence in what I was writing.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I share that. And so, yeah, you try things, and then when you get stuck, you then start thinking. I think that's a good approach, because it allows you to get a sense of how things work.
Yeah, another comment on that is that, ideally you want to think about it and, figure out the right way to go and then just do that. The problem is that when you're looking at a really new problem, you don't really know what the right way is. So this diving in, getting frustrated and thinking is, I think, inevitable, because what you're really doing is trying to figure out what the problem is. It's both a research and a development problem. If it were only development, then maybe a more thoughtful approach from the beginning would work.
Right, yeah. So if the problem already has the specification laid out for you, then maybe it's more of an approach where you can say, okay, we'll plan this out, we'll break it all out and just go to town. But
right. Yeah. I don't have a boss to give me a specification, so.
Yeah. Well, I think that's probably best.
Yes.
I don't like getting too exacting of specifications and not have creativity in the approach. So, yeah. Okay. So one thing I wanted to mention about Elm is you have a quote on elmlang.org. It is, quote, "You just follow the compiler errors and come out the other end with a working app." End quote. So I think, of course, this goes back to that, having the confidence and fearlessness with coding. And so you're able to do this, and you're able to tackle some, what I would say are fairly complex problems, right? So you're writing multiple parsers and rendering, so multiple steps here, and doing a lot of this work that, and then you can build upon.
Right.
So with the parser related work, and I mentioned this earlier, the scripted.io is the is what I understand is sort of the product that's come out of that
Yes,
work. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So, that's really the current endpoint of a long chain of development, which began with what I called mini LaTeX at the time. And one of the changes was I rewrote everything in Lambdera. And I had started it actually in the summer of my son's gap year, which also was the COVID year. The family was in France. And I'm not a great beach person, so when my wife and son were on the beach, I would find a cafe and work. And I tried it out. I sort of got stuck with the rendering of the math formulas using Kotek. And I was in touch with Mario, and he almost immediately gave me a solution to that. So, long story short, the work went really, really well. And then at one point, I decided that I should try to parse and render not just one language, but several. And I had done that before, but I decided to take a new approach here, basically because, I'm a solo developer and my resources of time and energy are limited. And so what I decided to do is that I would use a common AST for everything, for LaTeX, for a version of Markdown, and for an experimental language, which we called L0. It has more or less the same functionality as LaTeX, except the syntax is vaguely like Lisp. For example, if you want to make something bold, it's left bracket, B for bold, space, your text, close bracket. And I think of those as being functions. And you can nest them and compose them and blah, blah, blah. So anyway, this was a major rewrite of what I'd done before, but it's turned out to work really, really well. So you have these three languages that anybody can work in. For a lot of people, just Markdown with math and maybe some easy way of having extensions to that is enough. Maybe a high school teacher, for example. For other people, you need the full LaTeX thing. And, another advantage of this approach is that, since I control the parser and the renderers and all that, you can render Markdown and L0 to standard LaTeX. And then you can use that to print it because standard LaTeX can be sent to a program that converts it to PDF. And so what I did for that was I wrote a little Haskell app. I'm sort of proud of this. It's only 300 lines long. I was originally thinking, I'll just do this in Elixir, but again, my time is limited, so smaller is better. And so anyway, you push a button, it renders it to standard LaTeX regardless of the input language, sends it to this little app. It's somewhere in the cloud. It chugs away at it and sends back a link to the rendered PDF file. So anyway, that's sort of the main shtick of Scripta. And what I need to do is, get out of the perfecting it phase, which seems to last forever with me, and start pushing it out into the real world a little bit better. I'm not so good at that, I'm afraid.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think, you've definitely shared a lot of the work on it. So I think it's much appreciated from my perspective for all the work that you've done there and the packages that have come out of it as well. Okay. So now, you mentioned the Lambdera discovery, and so is Scripta.io built on top of Lambdera these days?
It is, yes.
You have a quote on the Lambdera website as well. It is, quote, Lambdera provides a warp speed, high productivity, and pure joy environment for developing web apps that just work, end quote.
Yeah, I definitely stand behind that. I guess I'm getting better at marketing speak, but yeah, I think those words represent my actual experience with Lambdera. By the way, one little note back to when I met Mario. We talked about this and that, and he said, well, as a mathematician, you will certainly learn Haskell. And it took me a while. I can't say I have learned it. Maybe that's an impossible task because that's such a big language. But indeed, I have dipped my toe into Haskell. And trying to learn more of it as time passes.
Sure. And actually, that brings up a question because, as Mario noted, I think that makes a lot of sense. And a lot of folks, I believe, who come from that realm, who have an understanding of the mathematics behind it and the language there, love Haskell, from what I gather. Mm-hmm. And then folks who come from a more industry background, maybe, let's say, not related to that, prefer Elm. So, but you still use a lot of Elm. So how do you match those? How does that match up in your mind?
Right. Well, I mostly use Elm, that's for sure, and I'm pretty proficient in it. So I can move a lot faster in Elm than I can in Haskell. I actually have been using ChatGPT to help me with Haskell, so I'm cheating a bit. But so I love the ideas behind Haskell, actually behind functional programming in general. I think Evan made some really, really good decisions about nomenclature and the way he presents the language, because Haskell can be fairly tricky, and I think the way Evan designed Elm, it makes it accessible. It makes a typed functional language accessible to a much, much wider audience. And I think it's also a matter of what is it that you're trying to accomplish, and what audience are you really addressing. So, one thing I discovered is, yes, Elm actually does have monads. We just don't commonly use that word. And, Evan has a way of describing things as, a monad has and then. I think that's the way he puts it. So, in other words, it's sort of an operational definition of what a monad is. Now, I don't mind using the word monad. That doesn't scare me. And in fact, I kind of like it in that I am interested in the history of ideas. And as far as I understand it, monad was first used by some mathematicians in the context of the theory of sheaves, whatever that happens to be. And then there was a computer scientist by Eugenio Moggi who sort of made the connection between monads and computer science. And then I believe it was Philip Wadler who really used these to make Haskell do various wondrous things. So, I'm kind of interested in that history. And, how do you trace that history? Well, one of the ways is you trace the usage of a certain term. So, but... And, there's just a side comment. I've looked at various explanations of monads on the web, and there are many terrible explanations. What my understanding of it is this, and I got this from, let's see, who's the fellow who, he's done a lot of podcasting and web blogging on functional programming. His name, he's very popular, but the name escapes me right now. But anyway, what I learned from some of his stuff is that it's all just about composition. Monads are a way of making things compose when they aren't really set up to do that, because, the domain and the range don't match. So anyway, too much of a digression there. Yeah.
No, that's good. That's good. And I think to your comment about looking at the history of things and using etymology, the where words come from to do that, I think is a great way to find out more and to understand, that with Elm, we don't have to think about that, right?
That's right.
I've been working with Elm for a long time, and I have enough of an understanding to be able to say that when I see and then that, yes, it is a monad. But, that's all I need.
That's exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah. And so to be able to know how we got to that point is an interesting thing to discover. So, I think that's great to hear about. And so, all right. So you did dip your toes into Haskell a little bit. Elm is really productive, and you've built Scripta.io. You're building things on Lambdera. Some of the other things that you've built include a BookLib app, and then more recently, this Elm Notebook.
Right.
So do you want to talk about any of those things?
Yeah, so actually Book Club that's kind of an old project, which I need to get back to and improve it. It's mostly used by my son and me to keep lists of the books we're reading and, make notes about them. And he's become an even more avid reader than I am. I mean, his room and the hallway leading to his room are lined with books. So what was the other app that you mentioned besides BookLib?
Elm Notebook.
Oh yeah, so that's a very recent project. It actually began when I was at Lambda Days in Krakow this summer, and a friend of mine recommended that I go to this talk by José Valim about Elm Live Book. And watching the talk, I thought, oh my gosh, this is great. We should have something like this for Elm. And I especially, the idea is to have some kind of like Jupyter notebooks, but which executes Elm code in its cells. And I think that, among other things, that would be great for teaching. It would be, you could actually run a computer science course where you have a notebook that has various explanations and then examples of code and then problems where people run the code in the notebook. And so that's actually getting very close to being done now. And after the talk, I went up and asked Jose, if that would be possible. And he said, well, yes, but you would have to compile Elm to Erlang. So I thought, okay, well, and he gave me a few tips about that. So I said, okay, well, I'll hack the Elm compiler and make it do that, which is a totally crazy idea. And after a couple of weeks of not doing anything, I realized there must be a pure Elm way of doing that. So I asked Martin Janacek whether his Elm and Elm compiler would do the job. And he said, no, you've got to use Minibill's Elm interpreter. And so I did that. Actually, it was very quick. In a couple of days, I had a proof of concept working. But, one of the things that is necessary if this is going to be useful to people, especially for people who are beginning, is that you've got to have good error messages. And I had some sort of half-assed error messages, but what you really need is the Elm compiler's messages. So I started thinking about that, and I talked to Evan about it at Elm Camp this summer, and he gave me a few tips. As usual, he says very few words, but they have high information content. And he wrote down in my little notebook a couple of lines about places to look at in the Elm compiler. So when I got back, after I sort of freed up some time, I started working on that. And that work has gone really, really well. I've got a fairly good version of a Lambda app that talks to the Elm compiler. And, I ship code to the Elm compiler. It replies with either an error message, which I had to kind of reverse engineer so as to properly decode and display, or with the result. So, I hope that in a few weeks I'll have something I can show to people.
Oh, okay. Well, that's exciting. Yeah, what you already have up on the site is already really interesting. And yeah, of course, having nice compiler errors is important for us. But what you have is really interesting because, for example, you bring in charts and you can create charts and immediately see those results in there and type your code. And so, so I eventually want to have that functionality in this app as well. I mean, this goes again to something that Evan has talked about, which is having, ways of doing data visualization, working with data. So I'm kind of exploring that. I mean, so that's an eventual goal, but I want to get the REPL part of it working first. And I should say Mario has been a great help to me on this because, just knowing the code base for the Elm compiler is rather large. Also, it's in Haskell, which is not my native language. So just knowing where to look is key. So Evan's little notes to me, plus Mario's little tips, have been invaluable. I mean, I would not be where I am now without those. Yeah, that sounds really great then. And again, this is, getting out of the basement, going and discovering these things by talking to people.
Right.
You seem to have done a great job of that. You mentioned going to Elm Camp, and then more recently, I didn't get to catch up with you, but I know you were at Strange Loop as well.
Right. Lots of people to talk to there.
Yeah. Did you find any discoveries there?
Actually, I had a really good talk with, I talked with Evan some more about Elm Notebook, and that was very, very helpful. And I talked to Ryan. He actually sat down with me one day after the talks and sort of worked up a prototype of what an Elm Notebook might be in Elm Land. That's his product, right?
Yes.
And actually, I learned something from him, which I haven't yet used, but I will have to use to extend the functionality of Elm Notebook. And that is that, instead of always working in the REPL, what I really need to do is to ship out to the Elm compiler code for a little mini Elm application. And Ryan did a few things that sort of gave me some tips on that. So, I'm gathering all the information that I get from other people, like Ryan, Mario, Evan. Eventually, I'll get there.
Yeah, that does sound like an important discovery there. So you had this idea that sort of came from going to Lambda Days, seeing what the Elixir Live book could do, and also I believe you mentioned Jupyter Notebooks as well as some of inspiration for that.
Yes, indeed.
Okay. Yeah, well, I'm excited to see what comes out of it, and I think it will be a really nice contribution to the community and be really useful. So, thank you for your work on that.
Yeah, it's been fun.
Yeah, it looks fun. It is fun to play with. So
it is.
What's already out there. So, all right. And so we've talked a lot about kind of the parser related work, what you've been doing now with Lambdera and Elm Notebook. We haven't talked a whole lot about the simulations. Did you want to talk about those a little bit? Yeah,
let me say a few words about that. So, I used to do this kind of stuff in my prior life as an academic. Actually, I should say, once a mathematician, always a mathematician. It's part of your being. It's not a lifestyle choice. And it's not something you do for a while and then you just stop, because it also helps in understanding lots of other stuff. But anyway, like a typical thing that I've done in almost every language that I've had contact with is to simulate Gambler's Ruin. So that's an easy one that involves stuff with random numbers and whatnot. But then I've done other things that are sort of more interesting. So one of them is there's this Schelling segregation model. All these, by the way, are on my github.io page. So it's jxxcarlson.github.io, and there's a list of these things there. So that's kind of an interesting thing. It presents itself as a grid. And Schelling was a sociologist, and what he found was that even very, very slight preferences of, whom you wish to associate with will almost always result in a quite strong segregated housing pattern. So, if you combine that with real measures that encourage segregation, you will definitely have it big time. But even slight things can cause that to occur. And it's a little bit like the phenomenon of crystallization in physics, very, very slightly. So another one that I did, and again, this is something I've done in practically every language that I've looked at, is to simulate heat flow. And this can also be done on a grid. I mean, the basic idea is that, if this temperature, you look at a cell, and its temperature will tend to evolve towards the average temperature of nearby cells. So if it's hotter than average, it'll become colder. If it's colder than average, it will become hotter. And, physicists think of this in terms of partial differential equations, but when you discretize them, you have what I just said. More recently, I've been fiddling around with this random exchange model, which is a physicist's way of understanding how inequality of wealth and income can arise. And it's similar to Schelling's model in the sense that, it's even more extreme. In the random exchange model, you can think of it as a game. So you have, say, 200 players. They all start out with, say, $10. And at every tick of the clock, maybe every second or maybe every minute. 2 players are chosen at random, and the first player gives $1 to the second player. Now, I put gives in quotes because maybe the second player provides a service or some goods to the first player, but we're only keeping track of the money here, okay? So everybody starts with the same amount of money. Everybody is subject to the same rules, so it's totally egalitarian. But the outcome is not egalitarian. What will happen after, a relatively short period of time is that you will evolve towards a state where if you divide it into quintiles, the top quintile will have most of the money, and the bottom quintile will be very, very poor. So I call them plutocrats and peons. What's interesting is this is very much like this distribution of income follows what statisticians would call the exponential distribution, or what physicists call the Boltzmann-Gibb distribution, which is used in describing the distribution of energy states in a gas, say. And so I fiddled around with that for a while, made a little Elm app that simulates that. And, it has disks that get fatter as they accumulate more wealth, and they shrink as the wealth declines. And then I said, well, what happens if we impose universal basic income? So now we're going to change the rules and say every 1,000 moves, the government is going to collect a tax. It's a fixed proportion of everybody's current stock of money. So if you have $1, it might be 1 cent, and if you have $10, it would be 10 cents, something like that. And then the total tax revenue collected at that stage is divided evenly and distributed to everybody, whether you're a plutocrat or a peasant, okay? And, the outcome is dramatically different. I mean, the distribution is no longer a Boltzmann distribution. And moreover, if you track the Gini index, which is an index of inequality, you'll find that especially the lower classes are much, much better off. I mean, they're still poor, but they are not destitute as they were in the sort of pure free market model. So, these kinds of models are controversial among economists. Some physicists quite like them, and I have an affinity for physics, so I sort of like it myself too. So those are the models, and they're really fun to play around with. And, one thing that I want to go back to, which is when I did this heat equation business, I was, of course, you want the models to run as fast as they possibly can. So there's this amazing language called Futhark. If you search Futhark Lang, Futhark, by the way, it's not a Klingon word; it's a real word. I think maybe an Icelandic word or a Danish word. Anyway, it's Futhark. So it's a typed functional language, and the creator of this language says, "Well, I'm not really a language developer; I'm a compiler writer." And the amazing thing about this is that because the language is a typed functional language, the compiler has enough information to perform extremely good optimizations so that the code can run very fast on a GPU. And I don't know about this because I've never done it myself, but it is said that writing GPU code, or especially good GPU code, is very, very difficult. And the advantage of Futhark is that normal human beings can write Futhark code, and then because the compiler has such good optimization properties, the code runs really fast. And I fiddled around. I wrote some code in Futhark. I unfortunately haven't had much of a chance to pursue that of late. But anyway, to summarize, what I would like to do with some of these models, like with wealth inequality, is to have some kind of a back end that does computations very fast and then communicates that very fast to the front end, which will naturally be written in Elm. So you have kind of a dashboard for talking to these simulations.
Yeah, and so this is what Futhark is what you talked about in the ElmConf 2019 talk.
Yes.
Yeah, making Elm talk to your personal supercomputer.
Righto.
Yeah, and what's interesting is just yesterday, before we are recording this, we are recording this on Friday the 13th.
Yes.
in October, by the way. Yeah. But anyway, yesterday there was this episode of Software Unscripted with Richard Feldman, where the creator of Futhark is talking on there. I haven't had a chance to listen to it yet, but I'm excited for that, and I think it kind of ties into, of course, what we're talking about now. So, yeah, that could be something interesting to look at.
Yeah, I will listen to that. He's a great guy. I actually met him finally when I was in Denmark a couple of years ago, and he's at the University of Copenhagen there, and he has a couple of videos up about Futhark, and he describes things in a typically Danish way, which means extremely understated. And so he gives these amazing performance figures, and he says, yeah, pretty good. Yeah, but actually it's really, really good.
We've talked about a lot of the simulations that you've done and how you've been able to make Elm talk with other languages, and there's some other fun stuff. The fake drum language app. Did you want to mention that?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's I was inspired to do this by a little passage that I read in James Gleick's book, The Information, and he describes this amazing thing, which I'll say only a few words about because it's linked to in the app. There's this drum app, this drum language in parts of Africa. I think there are many such drum languages. And the people who speak the native language are able to communicate over quite long distances by drumming. And there was an American missionary who was there who figured out how they did this. I mean, obviously they knew how it worked, but the way it works is as follows. These languages are usually tonal languages, so they have long vowels and short vowels. And so the drum language involves just two tones, let's say a low one and a high one, corresponding to long tones or long vowels and short vowels. So what they do when they just drum the pattern of vowels, long, short, short, long, 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 short, like that. And of course, the people who do this are highly trained. The people who do the drumming and the people who receive the messages they have the same training. And so what I decided to do is to make sort of a fake drum app, and you put in a piece of English text or some kind of text, and it will convert that to, it analyzes it into phonemes, and then it maps the phonemes to pitches and maybe links and notes, and then it synthesizes this and plays it. And to make it more fun, I have it do this with two voices. So if you go to the app, it has two little pieces of text in there, and you can press run. By the way, as far as I know, it only works on Chrome, so that's an important thing. And it's quite fun to listen to, and you can change the text yourself to experiment with it. So it's another thing that I would like to get back to at some point, and among other things, make it work on things other than just Chrome.
That was a fun one. I did play around with that as well.
Did you like the music that it produced?
Yeah, I liked what it made. It was a lot of fun to just type basically randomness and see what would come out of it.
Yeah, the interaction between the rhythms and the two parts is quite fun.
Yeah. And when you talked about this original drum language, it made me think with this short and the long. It made me think of Morse code.
Yes.
Do you know if those work in similar ways? Or
well, Morse code is longs and shorts.
Yeah.
And what I don't know, I think my sister had an opinion on this, but is Morse code really related to these drum languages? From the point of view of evolution, was it inspired by that? I don't know the answer to that. But they are very similar in that. Well, I guess what's different is that Morse code is not English doesn't have long and short vowels. So it's, I guess it's different. It's different, but it's the same in the sense that the output of the language is longs and shorts, but the passage from text to Morse code is not based on vowel lengths or some acoustic quality of the spoken word.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, well, that's really interesting, though, and so I'll put a link to that app in the show notes, as well as all the things that we've been talking about. And so, yeah, you've made a lot of really cool things. Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about before we get to picks?
I can't really think of anything else. I hope to discover other ideas to do fun stuff with. Like the idea of Elm Notebook is not something I'd been working on a long time. I was inspired to do it by a random event at Lambda Days. And, so I hope to put myself in situations where more random events can occur.
Yeah, I like that. Well, actually, this reminds me, I do have a question for you before we get to picks. Is there an underlying thread or motivation for your work? You've done work with parsing and simulations, teaching, science, art, music, even AI. We didn't even talk about that app.
Right.
And these fun things like the drum language app. And so, yeah, is there some type of thread with these?
I think again, it's sort of a personality-related thing. I mean, a lot of my friends think of me as an extremely disciplined person because I can sit and work for hours and hours and hours. That's a typical behavior pattern of mathematicians. But the fact is that I'm driven much less by discipline than by enthusiasm. So if if something inspires me, I'll dive in and spend a lot of work on it. Of course, one of the things I've worked at a lot are things that are related to my prior professional life, tools that will make it easier to do certain things like, put up class notes that involve mathematics. So Scripta is very well adapted to that, say in math or physics. So there's that sort of sub-theme, but the real theme is just, an idea comes and you go for it.
Yeah. So what is inspiring you today?
Well, my latest obsession, besides Elm Notebook, is wealth inequality, wealth and income inequality, which I think is one of the larger problems that both the U.S. and the world faces. And it'll face it even more as AI becomes more and more powerful of an influence in the economy. And, I don't think I personally can do anything about it, but I want to understand it better. I've been interested in this ever since I read this book called The Price of Inequality, which, it lays out one view of inequality is that a fairly substantial amount of inequality is needed in order to motivate people to create things. But the point of this book is that too great of a degree of inequality actually is a drag on the economy because it results in misallocation of resources. Instead of roads and schools, for example, it goes into yachts and second, third, fourth, and fifth homes. So I don't want to get too much into the politics of things, but it's a problem that is deserving of study.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's really interesting. And I like that, kind of as we're talking about the thread and motivation for your work, when I think about mathematics, I think about, there's this area that's looking at how to make logic and then make things to understand things and equality between things.
Yes.
And then there's this part of mathematics that's applying that, right? Creating simulations and trying to understand the unknown and to get that of an understanding. I think that's really important because, when you come out of the basement with that knowledge, right. Then you can share that with folks and that discovery can then lead to whatever changes people may want to make. So based on that understanding. Yeah, I think it's important. Very well put. Okay. Well, Jim, what picks do you have for us today?
Well, let's see. I have two. Let me do the second pick first, which is both of these are, sorry for all the paper noise there. Both of these are books that have influenced me a lot. So one of them is the structure and interpretation of programming languages. So I read that many, many years ago. But, for example, it gave me some basic understanding of parsers, for example. And it sort of infiltrated my mental DNA and has been very, very useful ever since then. And also, I think, just the general philosophy of program construction. So I highly recommend that. And I think when the book was written, the target language was Scheme. And these days one can use Racket either with Scheme as the chosen language in Racket or just Racket itself. So that's one pick. I think you can learn a lot from that book. And the other pick is the Mythical Man Month by Fred Brooks. So a friend of mine recommended this to me many, many years ago, long before I discovered Elm. And I want to read a little quote from the book. By the way, if you don't read the book, read the Wikipedia article because it sort of encapsulates many of the important points of the book. So here's the little quote I would like to read. To make a user-friendly system, the system must have conceptual integrity, which can only be achieved by separating architecture from implementation. A single chief architect, or a small number of architects, acting on the user's behalf, decide what goes in the system and what stays out. And the quote continues, but I think those two sentences very much describe Elm and also Evan's philosophy in creating Elm. And, there are different ways that projects can be organized, but Evan has a philosophy that is different from that of many language architects and many developers in general. It's not one of putting releases out every week or every month or even every year. It's a very deliberate process, and I think that, I respect it because I look at the results, and the results are fantastic.
Yeah, agreed. Definitely. Yeah, and when I think about this quote that you have here about conceptual integrity, it makes me think of auteurs. Mm-hmm. So this, the idea that there's this one person, in Elm, we may call Evan the BDFL, but, in movies, they're called the auteur. And so, you think about Werner Herzog, mm-hmm. or more recently, Quentin Tarantino, mm-hmm. These folks who have a particular vision, and in order to get that vision out, it needs to kind of follow that particular person's view and way of thinking of the world. And so, yeah, I agree. And, I think that, you look at the results. That's what's important from it, right?
Absolutely.
Is looking at what we have from it. And I mean, that's definitely the motivation for me to be here today, to mm-hmm. keep talking about Elm because, I use it for work and I enjoy using it. So.
Right. Same here, although in my case, work is just playing around with the stuff. I'm privileged in that I'm retired and I can work on whatever I want to.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, but since you can do that, you can choose whatever language, right? So, exactly. and the fact that you choose Elm, I think, mm-hmm. is a big win, for the community. And of course, if you enjoy it, then that's,
I do indeed.
That's wonderful.
No.
Excellent. Did you have any other picks for us?
No, I think that's it. I don't want to drone on too much. I'm reminded of, Ezra Pound's description of what a professor is. A professor is someone who can talk for 50 minutes. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're talking for 50 minutes, full of great content, but you're just talking for 50 minutes.
Right. All right. Well, I have a few picks, and the list kept growing as we get closer to this. We had to reschedule, and so unfortunately, my pick list got pretty long.
Well, that's good.
But I feel like it's been short recently, so I'm going to allow it for myself.
Good.
If you don't mind. So the first thing is Evan's talk from Strange Loop 2023 this year was just released. It's called The Economics of Programming Languages. Beautiful talk. it really makes you think. If our conversation about income inequality doesn't make you think, then I think looking at programming languages and how it relates to real estate can be a pretty interesting thing that you might get out of this. So that's all I'll say about that. But if that sounds interesting, you might want to check it out.
Absolutely.
And then 2 books. One is, and this relates to talking about the history of things. It's called In Pursuit of the Unknown by Ian Stewart. And it takes 17 math equations that change the world and talks about them and their place in history and how they have changed things. So that one was really fun. I mean, I can't say I've read all of it, but I've read almost half of it. If you're watching the video, I'm holding up my little bookmark there. And then the other one is Things to Make and Do in the Fourth Dimension by Matt Parker. And this one is also about mathematics. The subtitle is A Mathematician's Journey Through Narcissistic Numbers, Optimal Dating Algorithms, At Least 2 Kinds of Infinity, and more. But one of the things that I did out of this was I made this little tetraflexagon, which is this little thing that you cut out and then you fold this paper together in a particular way. And then when you open it up, you can fold it open and get different numbers depending on how you fold it.
Beautiful.
So yeah, it's a lot of fun to play around with some of the different things that this book will give you. And then it's very approachable, I think, from somebody without a degree in mathematics. So if that sounds interesting, check that out. And the last one, because my source for this book was a YouTube channel called Vsauce, hosted by Michael Stevens. And one of the things that a lot of the things actually, I think that are in this book, then Michael Stevens will present videos on. So I think they kind of go hand in hand. So I thought I would share that one as well. And I put links to all these things, including the ones that you have, all the different projects you've been working on, Jim. I appreciate you taking the time. Thanks to all the folks listening out there. Please rate and share if you're enjoying the show. And thanks, Jim, for coming to Elm Town.
Great chatting with you, Jared.